Chapter 14, Golden Age and Nova of Super Saturn. The great god, Saturn, identified by many names of many cultures, and often associated with the planet, which has been known in the most ancient times by that name, is the son of a god. In the ancient Buddhist liturgy, he is called Ravisuta, or son of the sun. Uranus, by his many names, does not have a father, but he is often referred to as the father of Saturn. Uranus is killed, castrated, defeated, retired, or dismissed, and usually it is the work of a Saturn figure. The physical circumstances of his end are those that may be associated with a stellar nova. As we have described it, so, too, Saturn comes to his end in a disastrous struggle thousands of years later, in favor of a new planetary god, Jupiter, also called by many names, and usually made the son of Saturn. There is reason to believe that the ancients, when they use the metaphor father-son, refer to sky bodies, meant the most direct and close relationship of one body to another. Saturn came into his own as king of the gods in the period following the destruction of Super Uranus and the ejection of the moon. We have recited only a portion of the mythic evidence for the period immediately following the rise of the moon god or goddess. There is little coherent knowledge of human societies of the time. Thousands of years were required for the reconstruction of the Earth's surface and the recovery of the biosphere. The possibilities of monumental and record-keeping cultures were low for many generations. Perhaps the moon would receive the extensive and obsessive worship of a great god, even the great god, for some 3,000 years before Saturn came into his own as ruler of the gods. More likely, we think, would be an earlier determination that the moon was fixed and captive, pallid, and earthly in origin, hence capable safely of dependent status, along with the Earth. Under Saturnian rule, Saturn would have ruled, therefore, either from 11,500 or from about 8,000 down to 5,700 years ago. The concluding date of 5,700 BP, before present, is related to proto-historical times, the time of the Great Deluge of Noah, in the Bible and the first dynasty of Egypt. The date is likely to be fixed with exactness someday. A Sumerian prison, for instance, names 10 kings who ruled before the flood, and says, "Then the flood swept over the earth. After the flood swept over, kingship again descended from heaven." Wiseman, the editor of the Prism, adds that there is actually a line drawn across the text to separate the post-diluvian events from those occurring before the flood. At this time, as the Saturn era moved towards a close, the disk of Saturn appeared 3 times larger than today's sun. Well, it would have to be. Its orbit about the sun took about 64 present days. Earth was still wheeling in orbit between the sun and Saturn, such that from Earth, Saturn looked about 4/5 as large as the sun. In a time close to 3 present days, Earth completed its circuit about the arc. Granted, an elliptical orbit, similar to that for binary stars of 64-day period, note D, Saturn and the Sun, would apparently expand and diminish in size. Talbot, page 181. With this movement, timekeeping would be suggestible and simple The Earth would also enjoy 2 seasons, cooler and warmer, each of more than 30 days duration. Brahma, as Super Saturn, absorbs, regurgitates, and reabsorbs as the ages pass. Mullen, page 15. So does Kronos, identified here with Super Saturn. As with Super Uranus, Kronos' instability made him less than an ideal father. In Greek myth, the great god Kronos, Saturn, swallowed at least 5 of the children born to him out of his sister's wife Rhea. She then hid her youngest, Zeus, and fed a wrapped stone to Kronos. When Zeus matured, he led a revolt that ended in the banishment of Kronos, after he had vomited up all his children alive. He's like, I was only kidding. The interpretation here is that Super Saturn was absorbing fragments that remained from the Super Uranus debacle, or ones erupted later by Super Saturn itself. Then, during its instability, it exploded back, a number of them. Before as a nova, it fissioned into 4 major parts, corresponding in the myth to Jupiter, Zeus, his brothers Hades and Poseidon, and Saturn Minor, the distant planet of today. That Saturn possessed satellites was known to the ancients, Trushman Ogiogan. That Saturn was regarded as a second sun. A night sun is shown by Cordona, 1977, page 33. That it was bright is claimed by numerous ancient texts and authors. Surveyed by Jastrow, Mullen, Greenberg, Sizemore, and Velikovsky, 1973, 1978. Cordona, 1977. That it became exceedingly brilliant just before the deluge of Noah is implied in Hebrew legends. Trushman Ogiogan, quoting Ginsburg. One Hebrew source has the star as bright as 100 suns. That widespread cultures held Saturn, the god responsible for the deluge, is made clear by several authors already cited. That Saturn, the planet, was deemed responsible for the flood is equally plain, especially Velikovsky, 1978 and 1979. Velikovsky appears to have been the first to claim that Saturn became a nova, an idea that he found buried in Jewish rabbinical commentaries on the deluge. That Jupiter was a prime element in the nova and subsequent events is evidenced in many of the same places. Akkadian Saturn reproaches Enlil, or Jupiter, for having caused the sky waters to fall. Yes, I've heard that Velikovsky got in trouble for with certain parties, I guess, that are affiliated with that, because that was knowledge they did not want, the horde to have, I guess, for lack of a better term. But Velikovsky didn't see people like that. That's one of the things I like about the man the most. He respected people. But he never got any. In the mainstream, that is. That Jupiter was a prime element in the nova and subsequent events is evidenced in many of the same places. Ea, the Akkadian Saturn, reproaches Enlil, or Jupiter, for having caused the sky waters to fall. Triceras, a son of Prajapati and a saintly Saturn figure, was a 3-headed god, with heads resembling the sun, the moon, and the fire, which we interpret respectively as Saturn itself. The celestial crescent and the electric arc, Indra, a Hindu Jupiter, slew Triceras with a thunderbolt, whereupon Triceras' 3 heads shone with brilliant energy until they were cut off, and then flocks of birds flew out of them, and his fever left his body. The powers that acted in the heavens were manifested to humans amidst increasing disaster. In terror, self-abasement, and pleading, man created a Uranus heaven. Man created a Uranus heaven, religion, and hoped for cosmic tranquility. Unanimously, the legends of the world acknowledge the human to be an imperfect creation. Some have him created more than once, as for instance, the Olmecs of Mexico. They sensed faults in their powerlessness against cosmic forces. They projected, then retrojected their faults to the behavior of the gods. These notions of imperfection were indelibly imprinted. Perhaps never until the past 200 years did humans believe that they and the natural environment might be benignly controlled through human intelligence. What may have most bothered the early humans was their inability to manage their internal psychic systems. They were interminably made anxious and self-reflective by their lack of self-control. From their ungovernable alter egos arise the huge variety of traits and behavior of the gods. They are artifacts of human conduct analogized to objective features of the natural environment. In every aspect of nature could be found some psychosciognomic and behavioral parallel with the self and with the primary human group with which the self identified. This intrinsic, practically congenital confusion of the inner and outer worlds of mankind was a two-way transaction that led humans to emulate the most extreme and complex manifestations of nature, with results upon human nature and culture that were, in modern perspective, often richly conservative, but frequently self-destructive as well. When the skies opened after the lunar disaster, the new great god, Super Saturn, was visible dimly through the clouds, the Purple Dawn era. To Earth's inhabitants, they had already been religious for millennia and might readily once more identify the sky objects with human forms and actions and project their hopes and fears upon the heavenly objects newly visible. And we still do it today. You just look out there at the nebulas. It's just uncanny how they look like people. It's crazy. But I can understand if you had that stuff, just up in the immediate sky, can you imagine how awesome it would be? It would be hard not to think that they're spirits. But even with ancient man, how crazy they were. Like if you've watched the video that I made on the Greeks, the Greek way, man, despotism and hardcore religion was all there was. The only place to expand the mind in was mathematics. Go figure. Now we know why it's so prominent in today's science. They had already been religious for millennia and might readily once more identify the sky objects with human forms and actions and project their hopes and fears upon the heavenly objects newly visible. Magic, spiritualism, and animism, which have been regarded sometimes as substitutes for the predecessors of celestial religion, were derivative accompaniments of the human preoccupation with celestial behavior. They were forms of homeopathic social medicine for the great disease, the Great Schism. The first religions were, in the broadest sense, monotheistic. Heaven was worshipped as the active power. As we set forth earlier, from the very beginning, humans have tended toward a supreme god. The Chinese, with Qian, may have been the most persistent in abstracting a monotheistic idea from the heavens and using it through a succession of specifically powerful heavenly forces. The I Ching gives this sequence. The first principle is heaven, Tien, eternally present, chaos without form. The second principle is the first sun, giver of time, called the arouser. The third principle is the second sun, an orderer, the limiter. The arouser appears to have been both Super Uranus and Saturn. A merging of memories over time also has to be found in other cultures. Figure 32. The Chinese craftsman god is Paraja. Fu Si, Nu Q, measure the squareness of the earth and the roundness of heaven with their implements. The god is depicted enthroned atop a serpent-like column arm in arm with his mate. It is tempting to suggest that this picture illustrates the situation during the age of Saturn, with the god star perched atop the fiery electric arc which rose above the world and faded in the distance into the golden sky. The ancient Persians and others asserted that God created Saturn, whence Saturday, on his sixth and last day of labor, before resting on the seventh day, whence Sabbath equals rest. Cardona, 1978, page 34. The implication is that all things, the separation of heaven and earth, the celestial objects thus revealed, the biosphere, the advent of the moon, and mankind, were all accomplished before Saturn appeared. Various scholars identify the biblical Elohim as Saturn, di Scintillana. More likely, the story adopts the designation of God employed during the Saturnian age, as, for example, it was assertedly retold by Moses in Genesis. But Elohim, at the beginning of Genesis, is behaving like the great inactive Demiurge, brooding over the Pangean chaos, who then becomes activated as Super Uranus in the troubled phase and creates the world. As mankind, born on the sixth day, here we go, received and perceived the cosmos, whereupon a more detailed account begins, relating the Hebrew experience with Saturn as distinct from the more general aboriginal human experience. When the gods changed, humans bowed to the changes. Of course, this repeated behavior over thousands of years is a significant motif in religious history. The lamentations over the death of Saturn were worldwide, because Saturn died in what was an historical period, although little of its civilization remains. The historical and obsessive mourning shows mankind affected by, not affecting, a real tragedy. Thousands of years after the death of the second son and the end of his age, the Roman government was acting to suppress infant sacrifice to Saturn. The parallels between could you imagine sacrificing your baby? They were nuts. The parallels between Saturn and Christ as a Saturnian figure are numerous. The Passion of Christ is historically and psychologically a reenactment of the character, the unjust death, and the resurrection of the god who had died some 4,000 years earlier as Osiris, Saturn. Frequently, efforts philosophically to cover over the deep trench of tradition connecting the two gods have failed to divert the mainstream. Such efforts have built a distinctive existential character for Christ. The age of Saturn in cultural terms was probably what is usually designated as Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic. It would be the age of Atlantis and other civilizations, lost to view in the disasters that followed. Saturn, who is generally accredited with bringing agriculture and other useful arts to mankind, was the first lord of the mill, a sky wheel grinding out material and spilling it upon the earth, gold, salt, sand, and stones, before it sank into the cosmic maelstrom. It ground salt into the sea, descentillana. The Saturnian deluge was caused by a saltwater tree cut down by Tapir. According to the Huna Indians, Ibid, in Hindu myth, the gods were churning the heavenly waters and ground salt into the seas. Tresman Hogan. Salt domes are among the most common of the mineral intrusions that are scattered over the Earth's surface. Small ones are about 1 cubic kilometer in extent, but some are several hundred times this extent. The largest known salt dome is in Kalu Island Bay, Merchantland, Louisiana. Its size is unknown, but it is estimated to be 43 kilometers long, 20 kilometers wide, and 6 kilometers deep. If so, it contains about 10 to the 13 tons of salt. Globally, 950 large salt domes are being used for mining. In some region, these domes are associated with petroleum and natural gas deposits. Other, figure 33, the churning of the sea. Other, Vishnu sits atop Mount Mandara, accompanied by his wife, Lakshmi. The mountain of the world is being spun as a great snake. Vasuki is pulled to and fro by the devas, grasping the snake's neck to the left, and the Asuras holding its head to the right. Together they churn the sea of milk, producing the liquid of immortality. Unfortunately, their churning became so violent that it threatened the earth, whereupon Vishnu, as the avatar of the turtle, seen here below the mountain, came to save the world by assuming the role as its pivot. Still, the world was threatened by the heat of the churning until Indra sent the deluge from heaven to quench the fire. Courtesy LaRousse Encyclopedia of Mythology. Places have sulfur deposits associated with the salt intrusions. Since most salt domes have been found scattered widely from the 3 major salt dome fields known today, it is unreasonable to think that only a small fraction of the buried salt has been discovered. These immense deposits of salt in the ground suggest a non-marine source of all salt. The salt in the seas can be explained in terms of salt falls from space. That's right. And, we have just tons of it. And for some reason, sea salt, not table salt, because they dye it and take all the minerals out. But sea salt is very good for you. It's got all the minerals that are in the human body. Every time I think about it deeply, it blows my mind. Something had to take place within humans had to exist. I mean, there has to be a link there. Whence comes the golden age of Saturn? We have the same amount of salt in our blood that resides in the oceans. The golden age of Saturn is golden. Whence comes the golden age of Saturn? Saturn is golden. So is the light on Earth. The interruptions of absorbing the children were spaced out, perhaps half a dozen marking disasters, over 2,300 years, that followed the lunar period. Meanwhile, life on Earth may have been easy in most places. There was no ice age. Travel by boat was easy, for the breezes were mild. Antarctic may have been mapped in this age. Since an ancient map showing its outline beneath the present snow apparently has been found, and since no later age would have been able to produce it because the coastline was invisible, Hapgood, 1966. The northernmost and southernmost regions were quite habitable, even tropical. The continental shelves and slopes had become livable. There was a plenitude of moisture and all-year warmth. The plenum and electrosphere were still insulating. Further, Further, Earth was holding its own surface atmosphere despite the thinning of the plenum under Saturn. The plenum became increasingly more transparent. The arc was less brilliant and more intermittent. Yet, the fire was there, binding Earth to its great god. Kronos is addressed in an Orphic hymn as "You who hold the indestructible bond," while his Babylonian alter ego held the bond of heaven and earth, Tressman Ogie Hogan. The central fire is also represented, likely, in the innumerable pillars, phalluses, bonds, pinnacle, pyramid, and one-legged god. Talbot, 1980, page 190. Even the jagged sickle with which Kronos castrated Uranus may have symbolized the electrical axis being severed from Super Uranus. Manu, a Hindu creator god of the flood, stood on one leg for thousands of years, contemplating his world design. All of these images are closely connected with Saturn, often by name as well as by symbol. Yahweh is imagined in Jewish legend as radiant atop Mount Zion, and Kronos Saturn ruled Mount Olympus before Zeus toppled him. Super Saturn sat atop the sky, a dull red disk 3 times the size of the present Sun. Because of the Earth's offset from the arc, the sub-solar position on Saturn's face was askew 21% from the center of its disk. The arc impinged upon about 5% of Saturn's face. Below Saturn, it widened like a tree until it passed Earth's horizon, where it was something like 15 degrees wide. The instant worldwide legendary connections between the Pleiades, the Deluge, and Saturn as god and planet, Cordona, 1978, point to the likelihood of the deluge as having occurred at the time when Super Saturn had masked the star group, and of the Pleiades having emerged for the first observable time in the sky at the zenith, following the clearing of this place by the actual bodies and the debris of the nova. The Pleiades were widely taken to be remnants of the deluge nova by the myths. The report of Seneca about Berosus history, to the effect that when the stars are lined up in Capricorn, a great flood occurs, can be interpreted to mean that the deluge occurred at the time of year when Capricorn was astrologically dominant, which, in the period when astrology crystallized, would have fallen near the end of the year. But the end of the year is the end of the age of Saturn. Hence, the floods of Capricorn are associated with the Saturnian deluge. Yes, after the age of Sagittarius, which is just what I thought. That's why I did that astrology show on Sagittarius. Also to be considered is the naming of the large sky area, the Celestial Sea, where the 2 Pisces, the zodiacal one, and the southern one, Cetus, whale, Eridanus, Styx, the river, of the band. Zodiacal. Capricornus and Aquarius are the dominant constellations. These aquatic images suggest the presence of vast celestial waters, and their one-time general location. Celestial aquatic motifs are common, as in the Gillespie stone, discovered near a small town of that name in northern Scotland. Figure 34. At the moment of the nova, the electric arc was interpreted long enough to free Mars, Earth, Apollo, and Mercury from their million-year captivity along the axis of the binary partners. Thereupon, they orbited the Sun independently for the first time, moving along the plane close to that of the binary. Their new, roughly coplanar orbits were similar to, but much more closely spaced than the orbits of these same planets today. At the same time of its nova, Super Saturn broke into broke into at least 3 major fragments. These pieces, constituting the present Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune, all receded from the Sun following the fission. Jupiter, the largest surviving piece, took up a position near the Earth's present orbit. Saturn Minor, the intermediate-sized part, blew into space beyond Mars' present orbit. Neptune receded beyond Jupiter's present orbit after depositing much water into the Earth's electrosphere. In the nova, charge was expelled from Super Saturn into the plenum and dispersed in surrounding space. It was as if the mass of the system had been reduced 2 1/2-fold, so the planetary motion slowed considerably. Neptune is the Latin identity of the Greek god Poseidon, brother of Jupiter, who, with another brother, Hades, helped Jupiter overturn their father in the Nova revolt. Poseidon was granted sovereignty of the seas and assumed his role on Earth. Before him, there had been Tethys, goddess of the sea on Earth, and Okeanos, god of the celestial sea girdling Earth. By implication, we conclude that Poseidon played a role in the deluge of the Earth. Figure 34, the Goldsby Stone. An interesting collection of ancient celestial motifs, we find aquatic creatures associated with the flood, which ended the age of Saturn, the destroyer god, who felled Saturn from his perch. Stop the column at the center of the world, the 2 stars connected, representing the earlier state of the world. Intertwined serpent, or the electric arc, serpents, which was quenched by the deluge. Synchrotron radiation emitted by the planets Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus have been detected, and cosmic ray sources have now been associated with these planets. Saturn, like Jupiter, emits much more energy than it receives from the Sun. Milton, 1978, Hunt and Burgess. The heat excess given off by the gaseous planets is an indication of their electrical nature. The emission of X-rays by a stellar source is often taken by astronomers as an indication of a very recent thermonuclear nova. Following our theory, the X-rays emitted by stars and these gaseous planets of the solar system come from electrical transactions. The effects of the deluges of Saturn are a subject beyond the scope of this book. See Patton and Fraser, 1916. Judging by the civilizations reported to have been inundated, the fall of waters must have been worldwide and extremely heavy. Those cultures that disappeared beneath the waters, de Grazia, 1981, are presumed to have been located at the low-lying coasts of continents, on what are now the continental shelves and slopes. The disappeared civilizations are not the only clues of how much water was involved. The great river canyons that course down the continental slopes to the abyss were in existence before the deluge, and were now inundated and probably greatly eroded, as were all of the valleys of the higher land. The Great Deluge would thus top up the ocean basins of the globe, covering the continental margins left dry after the Uranian deluges. Not only would more water fall on the earth than in earlier cataclysms, but it would fall in the much shorter period, if indeed the water came down as the Hebrew book of Genesis reports, in 40 days and 40 nights. Then 51% of the Earth's water descended in 3 1/2 million seconds, 411 tons per square kilometer per second. 1.5 meters of rain each hour. The whole deluge would have amounted to 1.42 kilometer depth of rain upon the Earth's entire surface. Wow, 2 miles almost, at least a mile. Much of this water would have to drain into the basins in order to deepen the seas by more than 2 kilometers. That's a lot. That such a deluge has dominated the myths and legends of the survivors is understandable. Saturn is reputed to have lit up brilliantly and preserved its light for 7 days before the deluge hit the Earth. This may be interpreted as a set of pre-fission flare-ups climaxing with the nova that destroyed Saturn. If the Earth were still only 14 gigameters from Saturn, the debris expanding away at 200 kilometers per second would encounter Earth in a little more than 19 hours. If the 40 days and nights period were of present duration, the problem of depositing so much water on the Earth would be practically impossible. Millions of heavy cyclones would be needed, even 1 per 30 square kilometers all over the Earth. If they were concentrated at the poles by the electrosphere high above the Earth and funneled down there, the damage might be less, but then the tremendous erosion would be visible today. We think that a longer span of time may have been required, and a day was translated memory of a longer regular interval unknown to us, a magical cipher or a historical error. The problem of deluging the Earth is nearly as difficult to cope with as the recent eruption of the Moon from the Earth. In both, almost unimaginable physical phenomena must be conjectured. The biospheric aspect, which often comes first to mind, can be rationalized on the equally incredible capacity of living populations to renew themselves, even postulating Manu and his tiny crew, or Noah and his family as sole survivors. And 1,000 years of exponential growth could fill the land to overflowing. As with the deluges, one does not have to move far from the extremities of the legend to enter the realms of the possible. The astrophysical aspect is more intimidating. See Kofar. To launch the waters and other debris from Saturn is readily conceivable given the nova. To guide it and land it requires the invention of low probability solutions. Even if the dynamics thus far presented can be accepted with respect to Earth, how does one explain the absence of water on Mercury, the Moon, and Mars, all of which would have been in or near the rush of water? Well, they found water on the Moon, they found water on Mars. I wouldn't be surprised, I bet there's water on Mercury too. Where has the water gone? There is almost no sign of water on them, or its having been on them in oceans. Where, too, is the salt? 2 types of probability occur. The 2 planets may have burst out of the magnetic tube ahead of the flood turning down towards the sun, whereas the Earth was entrapped, or else the flood can have descended the tube by a passage occupied at the moment by the Earth alone. In this case, the Moon occupied a special position besides, for it was a considerable distance from the Earth towards the perimeter of the tube. In any case, the Earth would still be luckier than Mercury or Mars, for both of these planets have ruined surfaces and no biospheres. 3 different Jewish legendary statements refer to a diminution of the Moon in size. Tressman, Ogie Hogan. This would occur presumably after the deluge, when the men followed the Earth out of the old magnetic tube and was repelled by Earth into a larger but still captive orbit. Two legends imply that the stars multiplied then, an expected improvement of visibility in the star system sack. The age of Jupiter now upon the world introduced mankind to the light of the stars and the darkness of the night.